today we are going to discuss some of the systems like the organization, the individual, the social part. Earlier we had been talking about the structure, its relationship and the overall perspective. Now we will be concentrating more on the different systems and how they impact the organizational behavior. Now basically if you see the person in the organizational sphere, it's just not a mechanical or structural part. There is a issue for cultivating mutuality, that mutuality between the individual, the organization and other aspects like groups, structure, functions, and this mutuality at the end of the day is the most important part of making a person a member of organization, a person who is integrally related to organization, and though it's ideal, but we can only hope that the individual and the organization become one entity. And this is created by the trust, integration and a positive outlook towards each other. The organization looks or takes the individual from a positive perspective, and the individual is also very positive in his or her attitude, beliefs, behavior, like that, all going towards the positivity. Then we have to understand the relationship between the organization and its people. Now, when we take up the individual system that has been referred as IS, we find that the individual is the nucleus of behavioral dynamics. Now, how this happens, this mutuality and the individual coming together. Now, when people are at work, that is, a person becomes an employee, there how the contact is created? Very simple. It is created through the job. Job, as we had earlier discussed, is a structured entity where certain roles, responsibilities, functions are predetermined and pre-decided. So, this job makes the individual an employee. That employee becomes the people who are at work. So, it can be at any level, at a worker level, at a management level, or at any decision making level. Now, how do we facilitate the whole process? Now, there is this notion of job description. You might have heard about it. Now, this job description is not a generic concept. It is institutionalized, and how it is institutionalized? It is with the help of the technological requirements, the goal requirements of the organization, and at the end of the day, it shapes, it makes, it enhances the visibility of the contract that occurs between the individual and the organization. Now, some of the processes, these are not an entire list, where the organization defines the role and the status of the person at various structural level. You already are familiar with the structural levels, from the top boss to the junior most employee. So, the roles are decided and the status determines to certain extent the kind of role. Then we have another important aspect is the responsibility. Now, let me remind you at this juncture that the responsibility of the person in the organization are not definitive, meaning that he or she is just not responsible for the functions assigned, but an overall welfare of his own, of the organization, of his co-workers and those who are in contact, because that is an integral part of the social system, which will be coming little later. So, the responsibilities are defined by both the individual as well as organization. Organization's role is to put the responsibility in concrete terms and get it extended to the individual. And this is offered as a job offer to the individual. So, the gist is the organization has certain requirements, individual has certain capabilities, capacities, and organization determines what role the individual is going to play, what responsibilities they have towards each other, and at the individual level what is offered as a job, whether it is a job of a secretary or the worker or the manager, whosoever. So, that becomes a very important aspect where the individual meets the organization and the organization meets the individual. Now, once the contract is accepted, that contract is in terms of the salary, job functions, objectives, roles, goals, responsibilities inside the organization and also outside the organization. Once the contract is accepted, the employee and the organization or the employer in simple terms, they become responsible for performing the role in a specified way. The worker has to work. Worker means not only the low level workers, but everybody. The worker is expected to perform in a particular way defined by the organization, that is a part of the contract, and this kind of function, this kind of effort gets rewarded in terms of the remuneration, benefits and security, which is mutually agreed upon. This is applicable to both the profit oriented organizations and also the non-profit oriented organizations like NGOs. What I mean to say that any organization, when it is accepting an individual as a member, it has to define the role, how it has to be performed, it has to define what kind of remuneration, financial or otherwise, what kind of benefits and security is extended to the individual, as well as individual knows, is very well understood about the way he or she is expected to perform. Now, what are the problems in this whole enterprise, especially regarding the individual? This problem comes whenever either the individual, or let us say the employee, and the organization both feel that the performance is not as per expectations. This gives rise to something known as conflict. Now, this conflict is, if it is negative, then it has to be managed, it has to be reduced, and if it is positive, going towards development, then both the individual as well as the organization has to see this kind of issue that is arising due to what kind of reasons. Say for example, the multilateral equity issues, fighting for one's rights in terms of maybe various levels, maybe in terms of salary, in terms of benefits, anything. The organization has to be careful because for a simple reason. The reason is that if the employee, one employee is not happy, is disgruntled, then it might affect other employees. So this is like a virus spreading across. So the conflict, whenever it arises, the organization's responsibility, duty is to see why it has come, what are the issues inherent, and handle the issues in a positive manner, as I said earlier. Now, it may have wider consequences, like for example, the unions. Unions become very active in supporting the workers at industrial unrest, and the organization tries to avoid it. One is by pressure, by power, by domination, by using the force. But that is not the solution. That is only temporarily can subdue the conflict. It's not going to go away. So, for that reason, we have another development as HRD, human resource development, which is proactive, which tries to see that the employee is happy, the employee is positive, right? And then this HRD starts with certain processes which become permanent features of any organization, like counseling people if they are in need of some kind of advice, some kind of getting to know what to do, what is the right thing to do and why it is happening. So, it is a very wide process, one needs to go into very detail, but there is no time right now. Second is mentoring. Mentoring has become very, very important because here we have somebody, some compatriot to talk to know, one who is empathic. So, mentoring becomes a part of the organization. And then motivation, another very, very important aspect where the industrial unrest or conflict is kept at bay. So, we have like the methods that are done from a proactive basis is training, performance management systems, career planning. All these become transparent, all these become useful for the employee as well as for the organization. So, there is a mutuality that is created between the employee and the organization through HRD, a developmental aspect where touching the individual, where he or she needs to be told, he needs to be supported. So, these kinds of aspects, these kinds of approaches towards dealing with the organization and the employee are not mechanical in nature, more humanistic in nature. So, then we come to another kind of conflict which arises with the individual, and here I am going to tell you in detail what this IS is made of. Basically, the individual has the cognitive and perceptual processes, and these cognitive and perceptual processes, which are the backbone of any individual understanding, are socially learned, specially related to values, attitudes and dispositions, and at the end of the day that determines the personality of the individual. Don't we say that this person is very negative, this person is very positive? All these are dependent on cognitive and perceptual processes which are socially learned mainly. And this we have understood in the SOBC, Stimulus, Organism, Behavior and Consequence model, that was given by Fred Luthans, how it is relevant in the earlier part of the lecture. The interpersonal relations in an organization actually start with role relationship, and this role that remain in the formal groups. So, the individual actually gets split. I shouldn't use the word split, but this happens. The individual, as he is or she is on the personal basis, and individual as a member of the group. Which group? The group that exists in the organization, and these are the formal groups which are created due to technological, process oriented or functional requirements. Now, briefly I will tell you what are the components of the individual system. One thing is the external stimulus or inputs to the individual, which can be direct or indirect. The corporate policies, the HR practices, all these are direct inputs to the individual system, and very important in this is the HR practice and the organizational climate and culture, which is creation in a major way by the HR practices. And one thing you have to remember is that there is a compulsive contact between people, and this compulsive contact can be in the form of supervisor subordinate relationship, group activities, the rules, to whom do you report, the procedures, what are the steps that are set by the organization, the demands of the technology and the work process. The conflicts in brief can be set by the efforts of cooperation, adjustment, accommodation, and conflicts cannot be just wished away or washed away. They can be managed by the individual, by the organization, and all these processes of smoothing through adjustment, through accommodation, through collaboration, through cooperation, all the management skills that are required along with the worker skills, which will be to certain extent set right as far as the conflicts are concerned. Now, the larger society is the indirect source. A person is just not a member because of the organization only. He or she might be spending 8 to 9 hours in the organization, but the rest of the time he or she spends in the larger society. So, what kind of society the person belongs to? A background check is needed, and the social processes of assimilation, acculturation, all these things, they create the values, attitudes, dispositions and personality of the individual, and These are the social processes which must be understood by the organization. When you fill a form, so many questions are asked about yourself. Why? All these are basically aimed at understanding the holistic individual, the individual from multidirectional perspective. And the problem is that the individual carries the idiocentric traits which are his or her own, coming from society, coming from the group, outside the organization to which one belongs. This affects the behavior of the person while in the organization. So, you really cannot segregate the social individual and the personal individual from the organizational individual. What is required is a holistic integration of all the forces where the individual becomes the organizational member, lives in the organization, breathes the organization while retaining his own individuality. It's a very difficult process but possible. If the organization doesn't pay attention to this fact, then what happens? The individual by force starts forming or becoming member of social cliques. These social cliques are formed from the choice of the individual in relation to other members, and these social cliques are very important for the organization to take care, because this is formed by the members of the organization, formal work groups, and these cliques are basically done to draw a kind of satisfaction outside the work performance, and these are very important, and these are formed to satisfy certain interests which cannot be or are not fulfilled by the organization. The cliques can harm the organization because the disgruntled individual gives a vent to their frustration against the organization. Sometimes the conflict may not be always apparent, but through cliques it keeps on happening, and organizations initially what they used to do, they used to break these cliques by transfer and by making or keeping people under watch, which is a compulsive thing. Another thing we have already talked about it, the communication is very important in dealing with these conflicts. There are bilateral, continuous, cyclic processes which need to be established. I won't go into detail because communication has been already dealt with. What is required in this communication is transparency, clarity, and timeliness. Everything has to be timely in order to develop positive behavior. Another thing I wanted to explain is grapevine, which is informal communication, which cannot be avoided by the organization, and these are usually, the grapevine is usually through informal communication. This may be due to use of information technology, social media, and they become very challenging. So, the perception is where it is influencing the individual system through interpretations, through internalization, and becoming very typical of the person. The formal organizational system can take care of the whole thing by something known as the organizational citizenship behavior, OCB, which is based on altruism, courtesy, civic virtue. Then you have the conscientiousness, sportsmanship. All these are parts of the OCB, which needs to be developed by both the organization as well as the individual. And there is another concept like ERB, which is extra role behavior, which means the individual makes an extra effort to remain a fruitful member of the organization and a positive main. The organization which makes efforts for bringing these becomes quite positive and satisfies the expectations of the individual.